firing line, I have been reminded, is 10 years old, which means that approximately 500 hours of conversation have gone out over the whole of this country, which means, or so we like to hope, that some of it, and I refer to those parts in which I figure only tangentially, make it worth looking at again. Television is, after all, a strange and thoroughly inscrutable new medium. How do important figures of the past sound, speaking 5, 10 years later? Do you see in their faces or in the way they express themselves anything remarkable, anything unexpected seen in retrospect? We decided to try to find out, and have come up with this hour and the next hour, abstracting a few minutes, some irritating, some charming, some grotesque, some even ennobling, a pastiche of our talkative times. Our aim is to get people who have something to say. They can say it on firing line without having to jump over roadblocks every few minutes. They can indulge their own styles of thought and speech. They can be frenetic or leisurely. They need only to watch their logic and be prepared to examine previously unexamined deposits of prejudice if they are burdened by them. Firing line is devoted to the proposition that interesting people can be interesting through the course of an entire hour. Failures at this level have been very few. But then, to quote the buoyant observation of Harold Nicholson, 99 people out of 100 are interesting, and the 100th is interesting because he is the exception. The firing line has never discouraged undisguised exercises in conversational exuberance. Never mind if the polemical ends are mean in comparison to the energies expended in scoring. There are, let's face it, some specially talented verbalists who speak in English. Why should the late Richard Crossman, the British socialist theoretician, politician, and editor, deny himself the use of his talents, even if feline, and even if he tells us that as a schoolmaster he specialized in teaching how it is that one accomplishes the impossible? Why deny him a forum for them?
It is a good practical politics, if you're on the left, to do the impossible. That is what you are there to do. Conservatives are there to do the possible. You are there to do the impossible.
The trouble is now you're being very loose semantically. By definition,
lucid?
No, loose.
Very precise.
By definition, you can't do the impossible.
I'm sorry, but by definition, you can in the modern. This is what I'm talking about.
Otherwise, it's not impossible.
It was impossible.
You can't argue with the premise.
Very
if
well.
it's impossible, that's a premise. You can't argue.
Well, I'm an old and hoary philosopher who for 7 years taught philosophy, so you can't tell me what I can teach.
I was a very good student.
Very good. And then I will explain to you. The impossible means what under existing preconditions is impossible. And of course, the art of politics consists of changing the preconditions so that it becomes possible. And that is what I mean by doing the impossible, because what I ever want to do is always the civil servants say, you can't do because of A, B, C, D, E. Your job is then to say, but I'll change E, which is possible to change.
Oh, sure.
And then the other becomes possible. Sure. So that you always can do the impossible if you know the keys to doing it, and radicalism means this.
Well, what you are contributing, among other things, is a definition of impossible, which I'll be glad to coexist with. The normally impossible means something that can't be done. For instance, if you say a human being can't, it's impossible for a human being to defy the laws of gravity. It doesn't mean that by introducing an airplane wing or an airfoil, he has defied the laws of gravity. He has simply come to terms with them. And this I take it to be...
Conquered them.
Yeah.
Not come to, on the opposite of coming to terms, what he has done is to say, look, I don't accept those preconditions, and I know enough that I will have them changed so that the thing is different.
No, he has said, you go ahead and maintain your gravity, but I'll show you how to lick it.
No, I'm sorry. He has also modified, in due course, the laws of gravity as well, by the way, because they also get changed by science. So we don't want to spend our time all the time on purely epistemological questions. Buckley, I mean, I'm delighted to do it. I'm an old hand at this argument.
Another polemicist who does not need any particular cause as a vehicle for her lambent badinage is Germaine Greer, the dreadnought women's liber of the early 70s. Any cause will do indeed. I like to think she reaches out for the lostest cause in town, merely to demonstrate her versatility, Germaine Greer.
There is an advertisement on English television. I don't usually get too steamed up about advertisements as sexist. I regard them as universally depraving in their influence. But in this case, the advertisement in question shows a man sitting with 3 women who are very harshly lit and have sort of greeny yellow frizzy hair, and they're screaming at each other like a bunch of parrots. And it flashes back to his courtship when this woman next to him was a soft and lovely girl, and then it comes back, and the didascalia, the thing is the motto. I can't think of the English word. I'm thinking in the wrong language. The motto is, some things haven't changed, or some things are still the same. And it's his mug of stout that hasn't changed. His wife has changed for the irrevocably worse. Now, I mean, I can see only one answer to that, which I find amazingly offensive, which is to show a lady of relative handsomeness sitting next to some boozy, blousy, overblown pig of a man drinking her dry sherry and thinking some things haven't changed. There's no point in making them withdraw the offense. You have to make them understand the nature of the offense, and I'm afraid the only way you can do it is by putting the shoe on the other foot.
Well, I think there's a lot of hyperbole in advertising, in political ideology, and in life.
Hyperbole is just a nice way of saying distortion in this case.
Sure.
It sounds prettier, but it's really just the same.
But can't you imagine people saying, at least as convincingly as you have just said, what you have just said, that democratic politics is universally depraving?
Plato said it, didn't he?
Yeah, correct. Oh, well, Plato was not very pro-democratic.
Well, the thing is that when you have
why
ritual
acknowledge
democracy,
why speak of such acknowledged madness that Alcibiades?
Oh, come.
No, I'm not.
We are flying high today.
But my point is very simply this: that you tend to be rather selective in what you categorically denounce.
Well, naturally, I'd be terrible if I went about categorically denouncing everything.
Well, but I think you do a certain amount of that. Advertising is universally depraving. If you advertise and say, be sure to have your chest x-rayed once a year, is that universally depraving?
Well, no, it isn't. I mean, performing a public service, telling people, for example, what civil rights
how do you know
they
what's public service? Suppose somebody says, drink Coca-Cola, pours it refreshes, and I then try Coca-Cola and it refreshes me.
Well,
and thenceforth, when I want to be refreshed, I take a Coca-Cola.
Depends how you feel about caffeine addiction among the young, really.
Well,
I'd be happier if they took the grain of caffeine out of it. And then it depends how you feel about refined sugar. It depends how you feel about symbolic nourishment.
The awful counterpart of the spontaneity of the private person is the cookie-cutter statements of the chiefs of state. It has proved easier to persuade chiefs of state to appear on firing line than to persuade a chief of state to say anything interesting on firing line. I'm often asked who are the best guests in the history of firing line. The answer is, on the whole, those who are less concerned with the diplomatic impact of what they say, even if they are convinced that what they say is or should be of historic importance. Al Lowenstein and Sidney Hook are unbeatable as practitioners of the polemical art. Many other guests have performed brilliantly in special situations, for instance, Senators Muskie and Gore. I'm asked also, who has refused to appear on firing line? Answer, surprisingly few major public figures. Nobody whose surname is Kennedy has ever accepted an invitation, nor has John Lindsay, nor Nelson Rockefeller. Some people have said, please call them again in 6 months, but 6 months later, some of them will have matured gracefully or ungracefully into total irrelevance. The best excuse for declining an invitation to appear is simply that you don't find it in your best interest to allot your time to the program. As regards chiefs of state, we go through the motions and typically are disappointed. John Forster of South Africa made his very first appearance on television on firing line on the eve of a South African election. He was not only guarded, but according to great blasts from the British and South African press, when the program appeared, positively misleading. Yitzhak Rabin was corseted by so many diplomatic, military, paramilitary, and psychological problems that he had finally to squat down on the entrenched positions from which he never moved. And so with Edward Heath, struggling to defeat Harold Wilson. We filmed this one in Washington, and in the makeup room he told me amiably that, of course, I must understand it, that he could not, while abroad, criticize any Englishman by name. I asked him if he couldn't do so with indirection, but he smiled me away, and for all his diplomacy, proceeded to lose the campaign. In Nairobi, the Foreign Secretary of Kenya, just before we entered the studio, announced casually that, of course, I understood that no mention could be made of any black leader in Africa, since this might embarrass him as foreign minister. The remark triggered a hectic hour of negotiation at the doorstep of the studio, at the end of which I was forced to tell him sadly, well, Mr. Secretary, it's your country, but it's my program, and the show, though already announced in the American press, was stillborn. Chiefs of state and their epigony tend to be disappointing, but an ex-chief of state can be something else. Harold Macmillan observes the formalities. He won't comment on current controversies in which his former colleagues are engaged, but he will expatiate on the meaning of it all from the vantage point of an elder statesman who dignifies the term. In the course of the hour, he came as close as anyone on firing line to mesmerizing the entire studio. This fragment is purely suggestive.
And I remember asking, I think the most experienced man in the whole of our service, who'd been by then 40 years, Sudan, Africa, everywhere. And I'd just attended a meeting of the council just before this step was to be taken, or not. And I said, are these people fit for self-government? He said, no, no, of course they're not, Prime Minister. Are they fit for independence? I said, no, he said, of course they're not. So what would you advise me to do? He said, give it them at once. And I said, but why? He said, because. I said, when will they be fit? He said, 15, 20 years. I said, why not wait? No, he said, because they'll be wasted years. They won't learn any more. They'll all be in rebellion. All the most intelligent people here I shall have to lock up. They won't spend it in learning more about the art of government. They'll simply spend it in prison. So the only thing now to do is to go on with it. But that was from a man who was the most, I wasn't a radical sort of extreme. He was the most experienced type of chap who lived all his life in it. He said, if they would spend the next 15 years learning, let them go on learning, but they won't, because all the intelligent people here, with the two wars, with the emotion of the world, they're determined to have it. And therefore they'll be wasted. We shall go back. We shall be worse than when we began.
And do you think he was right?
Absolutely right. We've been through all this. I used to say that people write and say how terrible it is that there's some trouble in an independent country. Well, what about our own? We murdered our king. We fought civil wars. We had the most bitter battles before we could get into a state of believing in some fair and reasonable government. You can't expect them suddenly to emerge. All you can do is to do your duty, to give them the greatest economic background you can, to teach them justice, to give them courts, to set up a best organization you can. And they'll make mistakes. But some won't, and they'll learn. But it's their country, it's not our country.
I don't suppose you want to anticipate any of the revelations of your forthcoming volume.
I've tried to write in this volume the story of a very extraordinary period in our history of Britain, 50 years, roughly, 1914 to 64. My childhood, 60 years. I was born in the age of the horse. Our home, drove down a dog cart to the station. Horse walked round, pumped up the water. And I end in the age of the jet plane.
Which doesn't, the Concorde, yeah.
Well, now, nothing as this ever happened in the world before. When Sir Robert Peel, when William IV dismissed his Lord Melbourne's cabinet, Sir Robert Peel was in Italy. And there was a great effort to get him back quickly. It was calculated, it was before the railways, it took him a little longer than it would have taken a Roman messenger from Rome to London. because the roads weren't quite so good as they had it. But you see, in 50 years, the whole thing's changed. Democracy's come, classes have changed. With Europe, it will be one of the great powers of the world. By itself, it's a very powerful force. And almost you forget that it's never been a great power except for 100 years in its history. People talk about England, what they really mean England between the Treaty of Vienna, between the Battle of Waterloo and the outbreak of the First World War. What was Elizabethan England? 2 million people, barbarous, regarded by the world as more or less on the outer edge of barbarity. And they stood up to Philip, who owned Spain, the Netherlands, practically all the old world, and claimed all the new. What was the England of Marlborough? Our population was 8 million, France 25 million. But with the alliances, with the arrangements, we not only won, but defeated him, but held out. What was Napoleon? England's population was 10 million. Napoleon had under his command the whole of the great French population, 30 million, and the whole of Europe. So did Hitler. Oh, no, you can't be so small that you're negligible. But size, wealth are not so important, although they are important, as courage and faith. But I've always thought that the peoples of the old Europe, having twice in my lifetime destroyed themselves by a kind of internecine war, like the Greeks did in the Peloponnesian War, must now get together. And if they work together, not so much only economically, which I think is a quite small part of it, but spiritually, politically, they can play a role similar to that of the United States, and much more valuable to the peace and fortunes of the world.
During the decade, women's liberation was all over the place, and if there is an outstanding figure in the field who didn't appear on firing line, you can report us to the Department of Affirmative Action. What seems many years ago, there was Bernadette Devlin, whose comet, though short-lived, was very bright, and who, notwithstanding her wit and spirit, might just have burnt out prematurely because of the little girl. I'd have as readily said little boy if Bernadette had had the misfortune of being male, because of the little girl attraction to the tidy formulas of fundamentalist Marxism. They came in waves, as shouldn't have surprised anyone. The theatrical star of the whole flock was Clare Luce, who calmly and authoritatively reinterpreted for us the traditional understanding of the meaning of the first chapter of the Old Testament.
Now, but I wish to go back to the heart of the question. The Old Testament myth of the Garden of Eden has aroused the ire of women feminists for generations. The legend creates, God creates heaven and earth in this legend. In Genesis, he then creates man. Man shares in the Spirit of God.
Now, man the male or man the synecdoche?
No,
for
man.
The human
God created Adam, the first man. I'm talking about this legend. He then more or less leaves Adam to his own devices, and Adam gets rather bored. And as an afterthought, God creates woman, but he doesn't even create a boom like that. He lets Adam give birth to Eve, thus denying to woman in the first few chapters of the Bible, of the Old Testament, the right to be the first mother. She's not even the first mother. Adam's her mother. And then as the legends goes along, the end of it, the rather cruel and dreadful end, is that Eve bears the burden of having brought sin and death into the world. Adam, in the most ungallant fashion, tries to blame the whole thing on Eve. The woman tempted me. He streaks for the bushes, gets himself in the bushes, hides from God, and then when God hauls him forth, blames it on the woman. Now there's your typical male chauvinist right from the beginning.
Most of the women who appeared on firing line grew up quite apparently without anybody's having suggested to them, certainly not with any success, that there was any evidence around to believe in the biological or cultural inferiority of women. Mary McCarthy is probably the most feared critic in greater literary New York and has been for generations. The notion that she ever suffered in virtue of being born a woman is closer to what some people wish were true than to what anybody believes is true. Her complaints aren't centered on the disadvantages of her sex. You're not suggesting, are you, that you have any difficulty in publishing your books?
No, but I do have difficulty in getting them reviewed. Not Birds of America, but I think maybe I'm...
Because of what?
Well, this is very mysterious. My book on Vietnam got perhaps 10 reviews in the entire United States. And my publisher was absolutely thunderstruck. It was it'd be easier to say where it wasn't reviewed than where it was. And to the point that people writing in, for biographical information for, these compilations of writers, this and that, would always stop my books with the group. And I'll write back and say, these titles exist. They're quite unaware of it, that the very fact these books existed was not known. It is a mystery. And of course, it's nice to be able to get your books published anyway. But it's a strange business.
Well, but I think, though you have said 4 or 5 times that you don't know, you nevertheless obviously intended to leave the impression that it's because your book was so much opposed to American policy.
No, I didn't.
Well, then how is it relevant in any way to a conversation that began by asking whether or not you were satisfied with the freedom to publish in America?
Well, I think the freedom to publish is not just a thing by itself. There ought to be some possibility of the fact of publications becoming known. Wouldn't you think so?
Oh, I certainly do. I certainly do. But I think that, Ward just in the Washington Post reviewing one of these books. Yes. He said, one hardly knows how to deal with this book, so transparent are the biases, so evident the intention to color Hanoi white and Washington black. Now, could it be...
He's sort of a square.
Yeah, I thought you'd have something appropriate to say there. But could it be that some editors reviewing this book thought it so blind
why didn't they
and
attack me?
so undiscriminating? Well, why didn't they review Robert Welch's book on Eisenhower?
Didn't they?
No.
Not at all?
Not at all.
Well, there's another mystery.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yes.
All right, explain it.
Well, they thought it was preposterous. They thought it was preposterous. That's right.
No, the few reviews I got were from people like the new leader, that is, old Cold Warriors, who still thought it worthwhile, attacking me and saying all that type of thing. Not that Ward just is an old Cold Warrior, he's not. But those people still thought it was worthwhile. I don't know. And I don't think those books are bad. I think...
well, I think all of your books should be reviewed ex officio, myself. Simply because it's interesting enough if you write a bad book. Dame Rebecca West, novelist, essayist, accepted by many as the finest woman stylist alive, although a formal feminist, is, like Clare Luce and Mary McCarthy, best engaged in arguing not for feminism, but in demonstrating the implausibility of any superstition based on the myth of the superior male. Even when discussing such alien subjects as British traitors, Philby, Burgess, and Maclean, and whilst spoofing the British establishment. Is it becoming sort of chic in some quarters to be a traitor as a sort of...
Well, I think it is in a way, because it's a form of dissent. But in any case, I think that the real feelings that people get out of reading the Philby books are annoyance at the establishment. They're great bricks to throw at the establishment. And I throw that brick myself. I think that the way that McLean, who was an alcoholic, a very charming and a very able alcoholic, I mean, when he could hardly stagger, he could get the files right. And Burgess, whom I thought a terrible bore, a dirty little man, and a terrible bore, and Kilby. And Kilby obviously was, I don't believe he was a very gifted man, because he ghosted, apparently, the book that was supposed to be Lanslow's autobiography, and it's terrible. It's the most vulgar, tabloidy stuff you can imagine. Well, I can't see...
I mean, that means that the Soviet Union has had to do with spies of less than optimum intelligence?
No, there must be somewhere, there must be spies of optimum intelligence. Those were not the ones. But what maddened me was that here were these people who were tolerated for years by their superiors because they were upper class.
Do you think that it made a difference that Mr. Philby went to Cambridge and had a public school education and so on? Do you think otherwise he would have been...
I think it must have. I think it must have, because, you see, he was historically interesting, that he wasn't really of a very important family. He was of a very charming family, but he wasn't of an important family.
If he'd been important, he wouldn't have been discovered yet, you mean?
No, what I mean is that he was important, not socially, but because he was the last head of the last leader of the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party, after all, is the heir of the Whigs, who are a very important party historically, and that was the basis of Maclean's importance. And Philby, of course, Philby had all the slight thrill that his father gave people, because his father was pro-Arab, and the British establishment, the British upper classes have always been pro-Arab. I think because the British upper class is very fond of horses.
Now,
Arabs have horses, and it all works together. Yes, that's quite true.
Do I understand that he therefore was not identified as a loyalty risk because the Arabs love horses?
Yes, I do. Because, look,
there's no better reason to think of it, is there?
If you listen to me, really, think of how the British, in the 19th century, the British always backed the Turks in the east of Europe because they were Turks and they were good horsemen. Well, it's the same thing. There's this kind of sporting life atmosphere about the Arabs that inclines the Philby was somebody who was, a great many English people approved of him because he was on the right side with those Bedouin chaps.
Norman Mailer, who has written on the subject of women's liberation, contriving with huge satisfaction to outrage the whole lot, is almost always most secure, even while being most tentative when discussing himself.
What I intended in the book was to show that there's that for years there's been this newspaper legend that had grown up about me, which was overblown and anomalous and funny. It was ridiculous. It had me as some sort of a savage, barbaric version of Hemingway. And in fact, I'm half the man's size, and physically, and probably in literary ways as well. And I just felt that it's part of the madness of America. For years, I felt that the greatest trouble with this country is that it's insane. Not the people, but the social mechanisms of the country are insane. Oddly enough, we'd agree on half the social mechanisms that are insane and part company altogether on the others. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I felt, one of the tiny things that I felt it was certainly insane about was me. Mm-hmm. Now, everyone has the idea, because I write about myself all the time, I think I'm enormously important. I don't, but it's the one thing I really do know something about. It's the one thing I claim to be an expert on, is myself and my own intellectual adventures.
Mm-hmm. There aren't as many people around as there used to be who devote themselves to attempting to bridge the gap between the city of God and the city of man. Contemporary concern is less over how the priest and the statesman should square off to each other than over how the diverse concerns of secular man impinge upon public policy. Noam Chomsky, a devout radical, had a whack at it, as did Leslie Fiedler, iconoclastic critic of the conventional critics of American culture, and B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist, arguing against any metaphysical belief in human dignity. Stephen Spender, the poet and retired British political radical, spoke anxiously on the subject of the separability of intellectual and artistic passion and politics.
You see, I think that propaganda is something imposed which is a failure of feeling in a way. I mean, I think that the art, say, that really came out of the working class or out of any politics would probably scarcely be recognizable as such, and would probably be by an artist who denied that he was interested in politics even. I mean, for instance, Auden wrote a marvelous poem called The Ogre, about the occupation of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union when the tanks marched in 1968. But Auden absolutely denied being a political artist. He didn't think of himself in that way. This just came out of his feelings, in which he would have written anyway.
The Canadian-American giant, perhaps the first man of critical letters now living, Hugh, tacitly sympathized with T.S. Eliot's refusal to identify himself with explicit political causes. I asked him, what are the political responsibilities of the artist?
I think we could put it somewhere along a spectrum of which we have two extreme cases within contemporary experience. At one end you have Solzhenitsyn, for whom the political responsibility is the overwhelming one. There is no way that Solzhenitsyn could exist without the Soviet tyranny. At least I cannot imagine him having even become a writer without the experiences he had. I think he himself is rather candid on the point. Having had these experiences, he is compelled to testify about them, to get them on the record, to tell the rest of the Russian people through the underground publication what is going on, to inform the rest of the world. So that's one extreme, where you have the political situation as explicit theme, subject, preoccupation. The other extreme would be a man like T.S. Eliot, who thought that his ultimate political responsibility was fulfilled by preserving, clarifying, and improving the language in which all discourse, including political discourse, goes on. And if what Eliot was writing at a given moment seemed terribly removed from questions of the day, and nevertheless he would have claimed that he was rendering a service to the language in which questions of the day could be approached. So these are two extremes. And then you can get various intermediate blends of them, I think.
The central concern of Firing Line has been with human freedom. How is it achieved? What forms does it take? Subject to what mitigating historical or cultural circumstances? Of some people, it is all very concrete as Senator George McGovern's concern over malnutrition, to which he devoted much attention in the early days of his campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination, Senator McGovern.
This raises what I do regard as a very fundamental question, and that is the question of whether the American public, dollar for dollar, is spending more because of malnutrition than we would spend to end it. Now, the Budget Bureau tried to answer that question. It's really hard to do what might be called a benefit-cost analysis of the food programs. But what the Budget Bureau concluded on the basis of a study that I've read very carefully, about a 100-page study, is that it costs the American taxpayer 3.5 times as much to deal with the wreckage of malnutrition as it would cost us to feed these people.
I'm not very sympathetic with analysis like that because, for instance, I'm sure I could do you a 100-page study in which I could show you that our toleration of divorce costs us $25 billion. I've heard it said that somebody once asked people, the cost accounting people out in Detroit, figure out how much we could sell everybody a black Cadillac with a stick shift for if we had 6 million orders for it. And they came out with a figure of $1,500. Now, we pay a very high cost for freedom. And now, you say, well, does that mean freedom for people to suffer from malnutrition? In fact, it does. It does precisely mean that. It means freedom for these rich people you're talking about to use their money less deftly than poorer people and end up with malnutrition problems. So I think it's wrong to start in and say we would be richer if everybody went to Groton.
Well,
let's everybody go to Groton.
Let me just remind you that of the 16 million people that we believe are suffering from bad diets, that are suffering from malnutrition, probably 10 million of those are children, most of them little children, some of them who were damaged mentally and physically before they were born. They were half destroyed while they were still in the mother's womb.
Which is a very good argument, in my judgment. It can be turned into a very good argument for saying that mothers oughtn't have the responsibility for the gestation period. And as a matter of fact, they shouldn't have the responsibility for the post-gestation period. There's a doctor here in Washington, D.C. says 70% of the children who come here have insufficient iron in their system.
That's right.
And why? Because they're giving too much milk to drink. Milk, which is considered a great luxury in other parts of the world. For Morris Udall, running for president 4 years later, freedom has a lot to do with the question how many people vote. Why is it that you take this rather unusual position that more people should vote? In fact, last time I caught you on the subject, you were wanting to provide for universal registration so that everybody could vote just by sort of sending in a postcard.
That's simply crucial. That's simply crucial.
Why is it crucial?
In the other democracies, they get 80 and 90% turnout. This last election, just let me make a point. This last election, and in '72, that Nixon mandate was given by less than half the voters in America. These are people who pay taxes, whose sons get drafted to go to Vietnam, and our society says we don't care whether you vote or not. As a matter of fact, a lot of Republicans and conservatives say we're better off if you don't vote. We're better off if a country has a system in which only the elite, the better educated, the more passionately involved in politics vote. I think that's wrong, and I think you destroy something very vital in democracy. When you adopt that philosophy, we ought to have this postcard registration bill. We need it badly.
Well, why? I'm telling you why.
because a democracy only works when people feel they're involved.
But that's not true.
Not the person in a penthouse in Manhattan or in Arizona, but the poor guy who's struggling, the widow. Society ought to reach out and say, we care whether you vote. We're going to send somebody to your door and register your vote, and we're going to help you to get to the polls.
The fact of the matter is that this is historical bombast, because democracy has worked in societies in which not many people vote. Democracy works splendidly in Switzerland.
All right, and it works better where you involve
They only allowed women to vote 18 months ago. For 700 years, only men voted.
Well, that was a history in our country. You had to have property. You had to have property to vote originally in this country.
Don't give me gratuitous history. Just tell me how you justify your statement that democracy doesn't work if not everybody goes to the polls.
I thought I said, and I'll qualify it, having nailed me into a corner, by saying it works best. And
how do you know?
You avoid this alienation, this feeling that you're left out, that your government doesn't care, when you have a system that makes people vote or involves them, encourages them to vote.
I absolutely flatly deny it. I think America is better governed than India, and in India, about 88% of people vote.
Well, in our society, with our level of education and involvement, and our kind of economy and government, I think we'd be so much more cohesive and have our heads on a lot straighter, and a lot fewer internal divisions if everybody voted.
You just think there'd be more Democrats in Congress.
Well, there probably would be.
For the controversial Enoch Powell, for several years a dominant political figure in Britain, though never his party's leader, freedom is the philosophical objective, but the business of politics is to take human nature into account.
A politician starts from human nature as it is. It is not his business to change it, nor is it changeable within measurable periods of time by political action. That's my belief. That's an assertion, I admit. But those words are indeed mine, and they represent my considered view. If I thought that the present effects of Commonwealth immigration in Britain were irreversible, then I would be looking for every possible method of minimizing the risk of future conflict and friction arising out of human nature as it is. But I happen to be convinced that these effects are to a large extent reversible. And therefore I must devote my attention and seek to get my colleagues in politics to devote their attention to reversing those consequences.
Well, can't you do the two simultaneously?
Well, no, because the one acts against the other.
Ian Smith, Prime Minister of Rhodesia and head of the minority party of white settlers who declared their independence from Britain, stresses the need to take practical circumstances into account before attempting to universalize freedom. Ian Smith.
In private life, then, the residents are able to decide whatever they want. As far as the public life is concerned, I would be surprised. I can't think offhand if there are places where the African is restricted. And yet, he was in many areas, say 10 years ago, before we came in as the government. Gradually, there has been a liberalizing of these things. And I believe that this is the correct policy, that you must do these things gradually as people wish to accept them. I think it is better that something like this comes from the heart than it is enforced by legislation, because if you have to enforce it, then it means it's artificial. It would be far better that it was genuine. We do have schools. You mentioned schools earlier on. I don't want to evade any of your questions. Again, it has always been traditional here that we've had separate schools, the same as the land. And we still have basically this position today. And again, we think there are many advantages for the African, because as I mentioned to you earlier, he was left so far behind as far as education was concerned. If they were to come in today into the European schools, I think you would find that they would be way behind the Europeans. And I think this would cause unfair competition and perhaps a certain feeling of inferiority.
Sir Oswald Mosley, repenting of the massive fascist movement he led during the 30s in Great Britain, which finally catapulted him into the Hooskow, wonders even now whether the final word has been said on the fusion of liberty and social action. I asked him whether the relatively genteel fascism of his own movement was indifferent to the factor of human freedom.
The basic error of fascism was the disregard for liberty. I don't plead as guilty on that as other people should and must plead guilty, because I always stood against imprisonment without trial, even before I suffered it myself. And I think the basic error of fascism was, in its drive for action at all cost, it overrode liberty. And the great problem of this present age is to synthesize the drive for action, which is completely necessary, with the preservation of individual liberty. And if we can achieve that, we've made some contribution to the thought of our age, and that's been my whole effort since the war.
Eudora Welty, the beloved and widely honored novelist, true to her highly particularized narrative art, looks for human liberation by taking us back to the concrete concerns of the community of men, women, and children known to each other.
If you grew up in the South, when things were relatively stable, when there was a lot of talk and so on, you get a great sense of a person's whole life, because you know all of the families, you know several generations, because they all live together. You know what happened to so-and-so clear through their lives. You get a narrative sense of your next door neighbor, instead of someone you just meet in the supermarket, which you do today, or you just see people in flashes. You had a sense of what happened to them and probably why, because look what happened to her grandmother.
Oh, I see.
And you watch life and it's happening. Well, that's a novel.
Although by no means ignorant or even insensitive to the thought of our activists, scientists, and philosophers, there are those who quietly maintain that secular concerns of however high an order, or after all is said and done, sheer distraction from the transcendent concerns. Richard Nixon, the object of so much animus over 5 years now that Lyndon Johnson was out of the way, was, along with all his policies and inventions, ultimately irrelevant in the opinion of Malcolm Muggeridge, about whom it would never have been suspected a dozen years ago that he would become perhaps the leading polemicist in the English-speaking world for the explicit rediscovery of Christianity. Whittaker Chambers once wrote that human freedom is a political reading of the Bible. Muggeridge would agree, emphasizing the need, however, for transcendent perspectives. Is there a nexus between this worship of false gods and socialism?
Socialism, again, rather like Watergate, I think, is a very, very trivial business. It's just was a sort of one of the many ersatz religions that were produced when I was young. When people lose their religious faith, Chesterton had a very good remark, but he said, when people don't believe in God, they don't then believe in nothing, they believe in anything. And socialism was one of the things that they believed in, that here you are, you could have a sort of collectivist arrangement instead of what was called private enterprise. Well, you and I know there's no private enterprise in the world now. There's also no socialism in the world in a theoretical sense. It had no bearing on things. But of course, it was a slogan. It crystallized certain opposition forces and even certain hopes. If you could point to one particular thing, it really was belief in science. It was the sort of the faith in science, first in the intellect, in explaining what life was about, and then in science, in putting at men's disposal the power to carry out their ideas and produce their kind of world. It's been, of course, a total failure.
Well, now, in what sense would you say that the Nixon administration is visibly, or if you prefer invisibly, afflicted by this heresy?
Well, obviously, he is like every other politician in the Western world. He makes his appeal essentially to people in materialist terms. He offers them
peace in our time.
Peace in order that they may be more wealthy and consume more and enjoy themselves more.
And die less.
And die less. Yes.
But that's not materialist, is it?
Well, it is if it's an end in itself. I think yes. I mean, I think that to make of going on living the ultimate pursuit of man is not a very noble or enlightened one. There's only one thing that's worth.
Aren't there certain Manichaean accents in what you say, really? Because surely you wouldn't call somebody seized by the materialist devil if he devotes his life, say, to better health.
No, not necessarily, but I would if he made it an end.
The end of war.
I would if he made it an end rather than a means. If he gave the impression that if you could make people healthy and if you could eliminate the danger of war, their lives would be enduringly satisfactory and happy. Yes, I would then. It's a question of means and ends, you know. Nixon or your Attlee or your Roosevelt or your Truman or your Heath or your Wilson, these people have no real importance in connection. They're just reed shaking, they just express it.
The discovery of a new end in life was done most incandescently, I suppose, by Augustine, when, turning the corner, he lit up the eyes of the millions who read his words, including a millennium and a half later Archbishop Fulton Sheen, who, with 2 other votaries, rejoiced over yet another translation of St. Augustine's Confessions.
It might be well to point out that really in literature there are 2 kinds of confessions. There's the confession of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the confessions of St. Augustine. But there's a world of difference between the purpose. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote his confessions in order to produce in us the same emotional feeling and sensations that he had. St. Augustine did not concentrate on his wounds. He concentrated on the physician. So if one, therefore, looks to him to find a long sex story, though his life was a sex life, and I wonder if a good title wouldn't, this is an awful thing to tell you now, would have been Under 30, because it's the story of a man up until he's 30 years of age.
What is it that made him a saint, Bishop Sheen? I mean, by having a fine mind and being a great teacher doesn't make you a saint necessarily, does it?
It's making Christ lovable. I think that's it. And you see, he had to struggle with exactly the same thing young people have to struggle against today. we get hung up on words that he had to use, like Manichaeanism. Well, it meant there were two sources, one of good and one of evil. But really what he was doing, he was battling with the problems that the young people are battling with today, namely determinism. Have I any freedom? Is there such a thing as guilt? And one of the reasons Augustine liked, I'll not call it Manichaeanism, but this new doctrine, was simply because he was no longer culpable. And it'd be just exactly like a young person today saying, I'm going to follow Marx because we are economically determined. I'm going to follow Freud because I am biologically and prenatally determined. So Augustine said, I'm going to follow Manichaeanism simply because I am determined historically by the ages. And thus he had no guilt.
To turn from the spiritual to the secularly sublime, all of us feel guilty about acts of commission as well as omission. I feel from time to time the cranky imperative to share a personal enthusiasm. Not quite personal, it is shared by many, but not by the tens of millions who worship at other altars. How can a generation so sensuous as our own remain insensitive to the music of the Baroque period? Why do they think it bloodless? Is there anything ever composed by Bob Dylan that is more voluptuous, more exciting than some of what Bach and Scarlatti did? I put this question to Fernando Valenti, arguably the finest harpsichordist in the world.
I think, for example, in the rock music, a sentiment is conceived, if you want to say that, and then the music accompanies it. I don't really think it is the expression of a sentiment or a feeling through the music. Because if you see the means of expression of most rock music, especially the bad rock music, you're not expressing anything through the music. You're expressing, yes, and the music exists in the background as an accessory after the crime or the whatever it is. Witness, for example, the melodies are not usually terribly calculated, not very well figured out. The reliance seems to be principally on repetition, which invariably has an impact. It has an impact on anybody. And also on sheer decibel power.
Now, to what extent did Bach depend on repeat simply because he wanted to fill out a program, or to what extent was there some sort of a symbiotic pleasure that was gotten from the fact that you did something and then did it again?
I would say that the act of repeating something intensifies the meaning which it is intended to convey. That's why it's an old pianistic trick, you know, to play anything that a composer writes twice. The first time must be played however it's played, and the second time must be an echo. Because that relieves you of any responsibility. It always sounds good and it always works. In Baroque music, it's quite the contrary. These people will say something to you, and just to make sure you've got it, they'll say it again. Furthermore, in the case of this piece, of this jig, if you want me to try to play, it's awfully difficult. There is another relationship, which is that being a jig, it's related to the dance. And if you have fun dancing this thing, why should you stop? You might as well do it again.
I see. Okay, let us have it.
Well, I'll try. This is a ticklish business. I'll do it with repeats.
For a printed, bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. That's Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. This program was produced by SICA, which is solely responsible for its content, and was funded in part by public television stations.
Thank you.